You're in a run for the President of the United States. My first question is why?
I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I could win. They're suing me. They won't provide me Secret Service protection.
You're the fifth person in your family to run. Two have been assassinated, and you don't get Secret Service.
The one group that I don't do well with, which is baby boomers, they think I'm genuinely a lunatic.
You could be the decider in this race. As we enter the heart of the 2024 presidential race, RFK Jr. aims to do what no third-party candidate has ever done: win the presidency. Will we have another Kennedy in the White House, or will he tip the scales towards either former President Trump or President Biden? This is a pivotal moment in American politics, reminiscent of those rare occasions when a third-party candidate shook up the status quo. Just a few weeks ago, I sat down with President Donald Trump, and tonight I'll dive into where RFK Jr. stands in one of the highest stakes elections of our lifetime. With RFK Jr. polling around 10% nationally and people's disenchantment with both Trump and Biden, could he be the wild card no one saw coming? How do you like to be addressed?
Robert,
Great.
I watched your show with President Trump. It was really good. The best I've ever seen him presenting himself. I think you brought out the best in him.
That was my plan. Robert, I'm very proud to sit down with you, by the way. And I do try to be a different kind of interviewer. I'm not a politician. I don't know squat about politics, nor do I desire to. I'm certainly not some kind of gotcha interviewer. Being from a psychological background and dealing with psychosocial issues, I try to go at these things from a different standpoint. And you can probably predict my first question, which will be very, very predictable. I hope your answer's not. I've spent a lot of my time professionally. I was in the litigation arena, which I know you've got great expertise in. I spent a lot of time preparing CEOs of Fortune 100 companies to testify, and I know about having their 4 talking points and pivoting back to those, and I know how politicians go about it. I know you have things that you cover when you're on the campaign trail, and I hope, like I did with President Trump, for people to get to know a side of you that maybe they don't get to see every day. You're in a run for the President of the United States, and my first question is why? Certainly from a third-party perspective, the odds have got to be long. So why are you doing it?
It wasn't something that I was sitting around thinking, I got to do this someday. I have a really good life. I have an amazing family, and I have a job where I'm very effective and where I was having fun at making a good living. But I saw something happening to my country that I couldn't really imagine. I saw this huge division that's so toxic now, so poisonous. When I lived through the 1960s, when my father ran for president at a time of great division, but I don't think we've seen anything like this since the American Civil War. And it's all amplified by the social media algorithms that are pushing us farther and farther into our positions, into these kind of tribal positions. But the origin of it is, I believe, the capture of our political parties by corporate interests and the corruption that's come from that. And the political parties are fueling that fire. I think this presidential campaign will cost about $15 billion. And that money is coming from these big corporations and this new kind of oligarchy of billionaires. And when they donate the money, they expect something in return. And it's transformed the political parties away from democracy. Their function is to advance the mercantile interests of the corporations that are funding them. And
is that true on both sides, Democrat and Republican?
Yeah, and a lot of times it's the same company as BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the defense contractors, an oil company and a coal company and a tobacco company, and the arms companies are more likely to give to the Republican Party. And then, there's a whole slew of the pharmaceutical companies are more likely to give to the Democrats. But they're both owned by, interests that are not necessarily America's interests. And I felt I was in a unique position to talk about this because I've spent, my entire career, 40 years, suing agencies and large polluters and the agencies that they've now captured. I've sued almost all of them. I've sued EPA as much as any other attorney. I've sued CDC, NIH, FDA, the public health agencies, the FCC, the USDA. And when you do this litigation, you get a PhD in corporate capture and how to unravel it. I also felt like I had a clarity of vision about what this country is supposed to look like. And I feel like I'm in a unique position to see how far it departed from those values.
Historically, third-party candidates are not successful. So are you the exception? And if not, what's the end game? What's your ultimate goal? Can you win?
I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I could win. We're in a unique time in American history now where we have the two least popular candidates running. We have between 70 and 80% of the American public saying they don't want that choice, that they want a different choice. I'm in a position, no independent candidate has been in history. All the polls that have shown me in a two-way race against President Trump show me beating him. All the polls that show me in a two-way race against President Biden show me beating him in a landslide. And, the Zogby poll is the biggest poll taken, and it shows me beating President Biden in a head-to-head race, winning 39 states and him only winning 11. I beat President Trump on a very, very narrow margin, but President Biden can't beat him. And there's never been an independent candidate who's been in that strong a position before.
Do you think President Biden is going to be the candidate for the Democrats?
I don't know. I think it's hard to imagine, but I think...
if they don't run him, who will they run?
I don't know. I stopped predicting the future in 2016 when President Trump won because I didn't think that was going to happen. And I just thought, okay, I'm not good at this, so I stopped.
Yeah, well, reading people the way I do, because it's my profession, I predicted with total confidence that he had the message, but he was not the messenger. I said, 100% he won't be elected. I said, you count on it. I know these things. Trust me. I was 100% wrong.
Yeah, my daughter, I have a daughter who never thinks about politics. She has nothing to do with it. And she came to me at the beginning of 2016. She said, Donald Trump's going to be the next president. And I said, you're crazy. You don't know anything. But
well, you're bringing up family, so let's talk about that elephant in the room, because your family has not endorsed your presidential candidacy. In fact, they've said in part, your siblings, Rory, Carrie, Kathleen, Joseph, put out a statement on X that said in part, the decision of our brother Bobby to run as a third-party candidate against Joe Biden is dangerous to our country. Bobby might share the same name as our father, but he does not share the same values, vision, or judgment. Today's announcement is deeply saddening for us. We denounce his candidacy and believe it is perilous for our country. And then others went on to say, we cannot do anything that in any way strips even one vote from President Biden. You put the Kennedy name on the ballot, and Democrats are going to feel torn. They also said they love you personally as an individual, but not your candidacy. How did you feel when you read all? Did you know that was coming?
Yeah, I knew it was coming. And, I have a big family, Dr. Phil. I think there's something like 105 cousins, and a lot of them are supporting me. Several of them are working prominently in my campaign. My cousin Anthony Shriver, who is helping run my campaign in Florida, and he has a daughter who, until recently, was in the senior staff level of my campaign. But, my family, listen, we were raised to differ with each other on issues. My father orchestrated debates between us every night at the dinner table, and they differ with me on a lot of issues. They differed with me on COVID, on the lockdowns, for example. They differ with me on the Ukraine war. And my family has a very close relationship with President Biden. So President Biden has a bust of my father behind him at the Oval Office. I've known President Biden for 40 years. It's not just a political friendship with my family, it's a personal friendship. They actually like him a lot, and they're very loyal to him. And 5 of them, including some of the ones that you mentioned, actually work for or with the administration. So I understand their distress, but I love my family. I feel loved by my family, and I feel like I can argue with them in a way that is congenial, that is spirited, but at the same time, I'm able to love them. I wish that for the rest of the country too. I wish that we could have civil debate again without hating each other.
I wonder if people think, I don't know Robert Kennedy Jr., but the people who do know him are saying really biting and critical things about him. They know him better than I do, so who am I to second guess them? They know him better. Was that their intent? Did they really intend to torpedo your campaign? Because as an outsider looking in, from a psychological standpoint, I think people would say, I'm going to substitute their judgment for mine because they know him better than I do. How do you keep people from substituting this judgment for their own?
There's an entire national press out there that is very opposed to me. What I would say to people is just listen to what I'm saying rather than other people's characterizations of me. And that's the most I can do. I know that what I'm doing right now is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I feel comfortable in my soul with that decision. And I'm working as hard as I can to make sure that to save this country. But ultimately, it's in God's hands. I have to work as hard as I can. And the slings and arrows that I take from people outside are, need to be irrelevant to me.
Let me ask you this, and then I want to get on to some of the policies, because there's a lot of things you and I agree about, actually, and I look at it from the cultural standpoint. I think perception is reality. If people believe something to be true to them, that's reality. And I know that to be true psychologically. You have a lot of theories that are non-consensual. Would you agree with that? They're not widely held theories?
The way I would put it is that I'm willing to depart from orthodoxies if I don't believe the evidence supports those orthodoxies.
I don't want to go into them because you've talked about them a lot of places, and I'm happy to put links up to every quality place that you've talked about them that you would like me to, but you've talked about vaccines, Wi-Fi waves that cross the blood barrier of the brain and break down the mitochondria of the cells, massive increase in school shootings subsequent to pharmas pushing antidepressants like Prozac, chemicals in the water contributing to sexual dysphoria, I assume gender dysphoria in kids, primarily boys, that the election in '04 was basically stolen, that Bill Gates' 5G networks constitute a mass surveillance system. They're not consensual, they're not widely held. I don't want to go into them now. Like vaccines, for example, you had a great conversation with my good friend Joe Rogan about that, and I'll put that link up so people can listen to it if they want to. Do you have a perception problem? People hear it and say, that's crazy conspiracy theory, but they don't really listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, you kind of put me in a bad position to rattle off a bunch of things I've supposedly said without giving the basis for, what I was saying. And let me just give you an example. The connection between atrazine, which is a chemical that is in about 63% of America's water supply, that there has been an increase in gender dysphoria in this country, and that we should be looking at reasons for that. There's been a series of studies, including one by a very famous scientist called Tyler Hayes at the University of Berkeley, published in the National Academy of Sciences journal, in which he took about 100 frogs, it may have been 70, and subjected them to atrazine at the levels that EPA considers safe. They were all male frogs, and 70% of those frogs became chemically castrated. 10% of the male frogs turned female and began producing fertile eggs. I've been working on endocrine disruptors, which are classes of chemicals like PCBs that I've been working on for 40 years that affect sexual development. It's not a theory, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's well documented. So what I said in that case is, I don't know if it's affecting gender dysphoria, I don't know if atrazine is, but isn't it something that we ought to study? You know, another thing you mentioned is the school shootings. When the Columbine shooting happened, I think 5 families brought lawsuits against the maker of Prozac, which had just been released. But there have been many, many articles since then, and a lot of evidence that some of these mass shootings that we're seeing in this country may be related to these new classes of drugs, of SSRIs and benzos. Those drugs have a black box warning on them that says they cause homicidal and suicidal behavior. We would take 120 million doses of SSRIs.
That's actually not what it says. It doesn't say they cause homicidal and suicidal behavior. It says they can put people at risk for those behaviors. It doesn't say it causes them. It says it can.
Okay, I thought I qualified it in that way, but you're correct.
Because I am an expert on that, and I am an expert on school shooters, and that is not a factor in that. But my point is not, are you correct or not? And for people who are rolling their eyes when you talk about frogs and then jump, no pun intended, to humans, comparative science is a very valid science, and that's how we get a lot of the discoveries that we do. I'm not taking issue with that at all. My question is, do you have a perception problem because people would form conclusions because on its face it sounds crazy, it sounds like a conspiracy theory? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, do you have a perception problem?
That question is yes, I do have a perception problem.
And you say I'm putting you in a bad position. I'm trying to clear it up because I see the difference. Like I say, comparative science is a valid thing to consider, and I disagree with some of the things. I think people who say that vaccines today cause autism, I would disagree with that. You're vaccinated, your children are vaccinated, you're talking about mercury accumulation and all, which has really been turned down in vaccines, and there are a lot of ways to get around this. Your position is not that radical. You're not putting people at risk with your position. We have ADD in America. We read headlines and we don't listen to the rest of it. I want to be somebody that stimulates people to say, hey, slow down and don't read the headline, read the story. Find out what he actually says about this before you make a decision. So if it's awkward to hear, it's because I think you have a perception problem, but I think the perception can be corrected if people will just take just a little time to hear what you actually say.
Yeah, and I have a perception problem, particularly in the mainstream media. I do very well, Phil, with kids. I'm beating President Trump and President Biden in Americans under 35 in the battleground states. There's a recent poll that has me beating President Trump and President Biden with Americans under 45 because they're listening to long-form interviews and they're not getting their news exclusively from the mainstream media. So they hear the longer explanation. They actually hear what I'm saying rather than the mischaracterizations of what I supposedly said.
You stand by what you say. You stand by your positions, correct?
Yes.
And you have explanations for them. Agree with it or disagree with it, but hear what I have to say. Don't just judge me because you think, well, that's some kooky theory. You do your homework. And I disagree with some of your conclusions. Some of them I agree with wholeheartedly. But I've taken the time to hear what you have to say. It's informed. You have a basis for what you say. It's all 100% good faith. And I think most people would change their opinion if they would take the time to listen.
Yeah, I think so too.
The mainstream media doesn't cover you the way you want to be covered. I speak to their audience, and that's why I started Meredith Street Media. That's why I do what I do and have as big an audience as I have across all the platforms, because they can get from me what they don't get from the mainstream media. I want to tell them what they don't get about Robert Kennedy Jr., because you wouldn't get this conversation on CNN or Fox, either one. The conversation we're having where I'm saying, you need to listen to what he has to say before you make up your mind.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, we find that I have a big conversion rate when people actually listen to me. As you say, I have a perception problem.
Yeah.
And one of my challenges in this election is that the mainstream media, the NBC, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, and CBS, won't allow me on to do a live interview. Most of them won't even allow a taped interview. But I've only done one live interview on CNN, but otherwise they won't let me on to do that.
Why do you think that is? What are they afraid of?
Well, I think there is a political alignment now with the media. They're overtly either Democrat or Republican. And I think the Democratic-oriented networks, they feel like I'm going to be a threat to President Biden if I'm even allowed on the air. And there's other more complex motives. One is, they get so much of their revenue from pharmaceutical interests. Roger Ailes was very supportive of me. He was the founder of Fox News. And
I knew him well.
And I came to him in 2014 with a documentary that I'd helped create about mercury in vaccines. And I showed it to him, and he was completely persuaded by this documentary. But he said, I can't let you get on to talk about it because we get 70% of our revenues in the evening news shows come from the pharmaceutical companies. I think all the networks are under that kind of pressure.
Let me ask you this about Big Pharma, and this is about vaccines. You say that the government regulators have been bought off by Big Pharma. I think that's what you're saying when you say that this entanglement has occurred. You said agency employees are actually getting royalties, getting payments on vaccines and drugs that they approve. Is that true?
Yes, there's a couple things happening with FDA. About 50% of FDA's budget comes from regulated industries, so mainly the pharmaceutical industries. You have agency capture on steroids. The principal objective of FDA today is to serve the mercantile interests of pharmaceutical companies. And that's why you see FDA not only approving all of these drugs that shouldn't be approved, but they also are, out to destroy things that are actually shown to be good for you that do not make profits for the pharmaceutical companies. But then the agency I was talking about in the quote that you just cited is NIH. And in 1980, we passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act, for the first time, allowed individual scientists and NIH as the agency to collect royalties on drugs on which they had done research. So, it really transformed, that law transformed NIH. When I was growing up, NIH was only 15 minutes from my home. And my mother had a secretary who was married to a scientist who worked there. And I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid, so I went to NIH all the time to look at the rats and look through the microscopes, et cetera. It was the premier scientific agency in the world. All the other countries, nobody in the world had anything like that. And they would look to America for science, and particularly for medical research, biomedical research. Well, after the Bayh-Dole Act, NIH began slowly migrating from a scientific research agency to a drug development incubator. And I think in 2016, and I may get these numbers wrong, but I think that year there were about 220 new drugs approved by FDA, and 100% of them came out of NIH. For example, the Moderna vaccine, NIH owns half of that vaccine, 50%. So the billions of dollars that vaccine makes, half of that goes to NIH, the agency, but there's also individuals, at least 4 and maybe 6 individuals who work for NIH who are high-level deputies under Anthony Fauci who get to collect $150,000 a year forever, not just for their lives, but their children. As long as that mRNA technology is on the market, they're going to be making money from it.
Okay,
and that is a conflict.
Hang on a minute now, because I don't want to blow by this too fast. So the National Institute of Health is getting a kickback, a bribe, a royalty, a share, whatever you want to call it. Is this not a clear conflict of interest?
Yes.
That's what you're pointing out, right?
Yeah, it is. People are shocked.
Why are you the only one talking about this?
If you talk about this kind of thing, you get censored on YouTube. You will not be allowed on the mainstream media to talk about these issues. It used to be that you could, and nowadays you cannot.
If there's some rational reason for it, then why would they try to censor and hide it?
I think it was an idealistic reason. This was, 1980, right? It was the time of the Reagan Revolution. If you put privatized incentives into the government agencies, that they would function better and more efficiently.
Yeah, but it's always the right time to do the right thing. And by the way, they can't get emergency approval for these things if there's a treatment available, you've also pointed out.
The whole approval of the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccines during COVID required them to suppress any other therapeutic drugs that may have been effective against COVID. And a lot of people believe, including myself, that there were therapeutics that were very, very effective against COVID, like ivermectin, like hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, and many, many others, and that they were deliberately suppressed because the government wanted to issue these emergency use authorizations, and it would have been illegal if they acknowledged that there was an existing drug that was approved for any purpose that was effective against COVID.
It seems to me that that's another conflict of interest, that they have to suppress this to get their payday.
We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. So we literally did worse than any country in the world, at least by that data point. And I think one of the reasons was the systematic suppression of things that could have helped patients in hospitals all over the country and individuals who just got COVID. That everybody was directed down one path, and it was the path that was being dictated from above.
Biden referred to this at one point as, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Was he pushing these vaccinations for the wrong reasons? You probably know I took a very strong position about the mismanagement of this quarantine, about the mismanagement of this pandemic, about what it did to our young people. But they're pushing these vaccines on children who were not at high risk. This was not a lethal virus for them. They're pushing this on children. They're pushing it on pregnant mothers. And when there's a profit motive involved here, I spent a lot of my life trying to figure out why people do what they do and don't do what they don't do. Like, if somebody's selling me a car, if a mechanic's telling me this is sound, I want to know if he also owns the car, right? I mean, don't you want to know somebody's motives? And doesn't this call into question the motive? You're saying this should be transparent. We should know this if people are telling us this is what we should do, and oh, by the way, I make money every time you do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous and useful quote by Upton Sinclair: it's almost impossible to convince a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. It's just common sense that we want to know, you want to eliminate conflicts of interest, so that particularly among government officials, so that you know that they're acting on behalf of the public welfare and they don't have a private stake in their decision.
Did you say the COVID vaccine was the deadliest vaccine ever approved?
Well, it was the deadliest in terms of how many deaths were reported to the VAERS database. Now, you don't know causation. I took the vaccine, and the next day I had a heart attack or a stroke or myocarditis. You can't say for sure that that injury was attributable to that.
It was correlational, not causative,
right.
but it still occurs together.
When you see this huge uptick within, I think, the first year of the release of the COVID vaccine, there were more reports to COVID of deaths and injuries than all vaccines put together for the previous almost 36 years. So in that sense, yeah, it was the deadliest vaccine ever. And, you know, part of that is that it was mandated for so many people.
One of your key focus points is to unravel the corporate capture of government agencies and the corporate capture of health agencies. How do you achieve that?
Well, that's a good question. I think each agency you have to address on its, because they all have unique structures. Part of the problem is policy and structure, and part of it is personnel. If there are perverse incentives, like at FDA, where 50% of the budget comes from pharma, or NIH, where regulators are getting paid to make sure that drugs get on the market. Congress actually had hearings on it. And Anthony Fauci testified at those hearings because he was making money on some of these, you know, drugs that he had developed. So you have a scientist who is supposed to be looking for problems in that drug. That's what his job is as a regulator, find the problems to make sure you're protecting the public. But if he's paying for his mortgage and he's paying for his children's education, he's paying for his boat, he's paying for his alimony from that 150 grand a year, you could expect and you could predict that he's going to be less vigilant about finding problems. That's what we call a perverse incentive, and those needed to be undone. Because of the revolving door at the top of these agencies, the people who tend to get promoted are people who are willing to carry water for the industry. The regulators become sock puppets of the industry, and when people get to the end of their careers for a government agency, they go work for the industries they regulated. So right before they leave, they tend to do a lot of favors for those industries and their senior management. And that example, that bad example, tends to percolate downward throughout their whole division.
And then they go across the street and work for who they were regulating.
Yeah. So when you do that, you can't drain the swamp. These are all swamp creatures. Mm-hmm. And it amplifies that corporate capture that we see, you know, happening anyway at the lower level. But you can clean it out. And I understand the perverse incentives that need to be changed right away in order to change agency culture and get them doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is to be serving the public interest and protecting public health. We're now the unhealthiest country in the world. Yeah. We have the highest chronic disease burden in the world. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, almost 60% do. And nobody's doing anything about this. Nobody's talking about it. The autism rates in my generation, depending on which study, 1 in 2,500 or 1 in 10,000. In my kids' generation, it's 1 in every 34 kids, 1 in every 22 boys. So Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. EPA came back and said, it's a red line, 1989. And so something happened in 1989. We know this epidemic is not happening because of genes. Genes don't cause epidemics, as you know. You need an environmental toxin. So why are we looking for what toxin it was that hit every demographic, became ubiquitous in 1989? And those are the studies that I'm going to get them to do as president.
Well, let's talk about becoming president. Do we have a problem in this country with election integrity?
Yes.
And what is the problem?
The problem is that machines can be hacked. And by the way, this has become a partisan issue recently where the Republicans are complaining about it and the Democrats aren't. But 5 years ago, it was the opposite. I mean, every Democrat believed in his heart and in his head that the 2001 election was stolen from Al Gore. I wrote an award-winning article showing how the 2004 election was also tampered with. Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders followers believe that it was stolen from him in 2016, and Hillary Clinton's publicly said it was stolen from her in 2020 in the Atlanta Monthly. So both sides are complaining about it. And we ought to be able to fix it. We put a man on the moon. We have ATMs on every corner in every city, and they never miscount. They never give you more money than you want.
What do you think about the fact that all of a sudden, and it seems all of a sudden to me, maybe it's not, we have ballot harvesting where people are going around and collecting ballots. What happened to just having elections where people show up and vote? If somebody's infirm, absolutely okay. Don't put resistance in front of people. But now it seems like it's just wholesale. How do you oversee that? It just seems like it's ripe for fraud as opposed to where you have someone overseeing it.
Yeah, and we need to fix that. And it's easy to fix. You need to have paper ballots. And you need a low threshold for a recount so that if anybody says, that there was a problem here, you need to, it triggers a recount and a right to a recount. The other thing, I'm going to do this when I get into office. One of the big issues that separate all this is happening, Phil, because of the divide. Everybody knows that we need a election system that all Americans have total faith in, that above anything else. And when you cast your vote, it's going to be counted. We don't have that. We don't have it because Republicans and Democrats aren't sitting down with each other and saying, what do we need to do to make this happen? Instead, they're taking sides. And let me give you an idea of one of the solutions for this. One of the issues is voter ID. Democrats don't like voter ID and demand a requirement for voter ID at the voting booth. Why not? The reason for that is because there are tens of millions of people in this country who are eligible to vote, but they don't have government-issued photo ID. They don't have driver's licenses. Most of them are Democratic constituencies. They're elderly people whose licenses have expired. They're young students, and they're urban minorities who don't have a driver's license because they don't need one. And so what I'm going to do the day I get into office, I'm going to order the State Department and the post office to begin issuing passport cards to any American who can't afford them for free. The passport card is a government-issued photo ID. There's no vaccine information or medical information. It's just an ID. That's going to solve three huge problems. One, if you don't have a government-issued photo ID in this country, you are a second-class citizen. You can't open a bank account. You can't pick up your kids at school. You can't go to a hotel. You can't get on an airplane. Number two, if we had a government-issued photo ID, it would solve a lot of the problems of the border. Because right now,
sure would.
An employer is legally, it's criminally liable if they hire an undocumented immigrant. And then the third is the election integrity issue. So my team has reached out to civil rights leaders, leading civil rights leaders around the country, Al Sharpton, Andrew Young, and others, and said, if I issue this government-issued photo ID, will you withdraw your objection to demanding photo ID at the voting booth? And they've said yes. Problem solved.
Well, I agree. Then you're saying do that instead of having all these mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting.
Anything where there's a hole in election integrity, we got to get rid of it. We got to encourage as many people to vote.
Should we be concerned that almost a third of Americans, have a lack of confidence in votes are going to be counted?
That's for democracy, isn't it?
Yeah, Scott Rasmussen has done a poll, and he asked people the following, and this is really disturbing to me. The question was, is it okay to win an election by cheating? 7% of all Americans said yes. 35% of elites said yes, and that was defined by they made $150,000 a year, they were urban dwellers and postgraduates. 69% said yes if they made $150,000 a year, were urban dwellers, postgraduates who talked politics on a daily basis. 69% of those that were active in politics said, yeah, it was okay if my candidate had to cheat to win. You could knock me over with a feather. What the hell are people thinking?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I got a lot of those kind of surprises during COVID because I learned how many people were okay with government censoring speech, with government closing down every church in this country, with government closing our schools when we're already having a mental health crisis with our kids.
The people that shut the schools down are the same people that collects data that told them we had the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness among young people since we had started keeping records. And they shut down the school systems, which is where those kids get their stimulation. It's where they learn to interact. It's where they do competition. And it's also where we have mandated reporters who keep their eyes on them and watch for abuse and sexual molestation. And instead, we took those eyes off of those kids, sent them home behind closed doors, abandoning them to the very abusers that we were watching for, and referrals for that kind of care dropped to like 50% across the country.
It was the only indicia of social disintegration that actually improved because we stopped counting the abuse.
It just stopped getting reported that
Well, it
much.
probably got worse.
Of course it did. We abandoned those kids to their abusers, and their answer from Fauci and others was, well, we're doing the best we can with what we know. No, they were not doing the best they can with what they knew. They had no plan to reopen the schools when they closed them down. And they just had a new hammer and everything looked like a nail. And so they just started shutting this business, shutting this school, shutting this, and the teachers' unions were wielding the power.
Well, you know, there was a Brown University study that showed that during those lockdowns, there was a 22% drop in IQ among the youngest Americans. And then CDC, in 2023, revised its milestones. Prior to that, the milestone was that a kid should walk unassisted. That means without touching furniture at 12 months. They now are 18 months. The prior milestone was that children should have 50 words by 24 months, and now that's 30 months. So they're normalizing.
Just keep lowering the standards.
They're normalizing the harm that they did to our children.
And they're doing it in school. 30+% of fifth graders can't read a simple sentence. Almost 30% of eighth graders can't read a most fundamental sentence, and 19% of high school graduates can't read even the instructions on a prescription that they get at the drugstore. How are we continuing to pass these people, Robert? How are you going to fix that?
Well, the education system is a whole other issue. To me, the only way to fix the school system is with charter schools and with school choice. And you need to give the principals more power. And then if that principal's not educating children, the parents get a choice to leave and take their kids somewhere else. We can no longer tell parents, just wait, particularly urban parents who are dealing with these schools that are just... they're criminal enterprises, what we are doing to our kids. They're producing that kind of product. Yeah. If you're failing, there ought to be a market so that somebody has a choice to go somewhere else. And that's the only way that we're going to say rescue these kids. And that needs to be all of our focus. How do we rescue these children?
Do you believe that our educational system is on the brink of catastrophic collapse?
I think it's already collapsed. I think, the outcomes that you just inventoried is evidence of a utter collapse of the system. We can fix the system, but you need to do something disruptive. Which,
of course, takes money. And I want to talk about money. When your uncle was president, he seemed to have the idea that a lower tax rate brought about a higher tax revenue. What's your view on that?
I'm not going to raise the tax rates in this country. I may switch around some of the tax burdens to incentivize the best behavior, but I'm not going to raise taxes. We want to lower tax rates as much as possible. We have a $34 trillion debt, and we can't just print money. I saw President Trump on your show, and it was an amazing show, and I think you really bring out the best in people, and I know that's your objective. But he was talking about how strong the economy was during his administration, But he printed $8 trillion, which is more than all presidents combined from George Washington to George W. Bush in 283 years of history. So it's pretty easy to produce the illusion of wealth if you're stealing money from future generations, and printing money like that is just theft. That can't be our solution.
How much has the Biden administration printed?
$6.3 billion today, but they will beat President Trump. Yeah, that's right. What's wrong? And it's the addiction to war. It's the chronic disease epidemic, the biggest cost. That's costing us $4.3 trillion. We have to end that. We have to, or we're dead. It's 4.3. It's 5 times our military budget. We've gone from 6% of GDP to healthcare to about 18%. And 6% when my uncle was president, 18% today, and it's growing exponentially. And we are we spend more on healthcare than any other country in the world, 2 or 3 times per capita what the Europeans, and we're 79th in health outcomes. We're behind Costa Rica, we're behind Mongolia, we're behind Cuba, we're behind Nicaragua.
How is that even possible? There are 50 countries in the world where a mother has a better chance of surviving childbirth than America. 51 countries in the world where the infant has a better chance of surviving than America. America!
Yeah.
How is that possible,
when
Robert?
When I were kids, we had the best healthcare system in the world, bar none. Today, we have the worst. We have extraordinary doctors in this country, extraordinary, that are doing things that are incredibly innovative. But we have the worst health outcomes. It's because of chronic disease. And we've got to figure out what's causing it, eliminate it. We have, and it's not rocket science. It's glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. It's neonicotinoid pesticides. It's atrazine. It's PFOAs, the forever chemicals that are in all of our child's pajamas. They're in our furniture. I've litigated on them as well. It's high fructose corn syrup.
These other countries don't have that?
No, if you want to drink a Coke, drink a Mexican Coke, because they don't allow it down there. There's 1,000 ingredients in our food that are banned in Europe. And we're poisoning, we're mass poisoning an entire generation of kids. These kids are obese. It's not because they suddenly got lazy. It's not because, because we're mass poisoning them. And I, as president, I'm going to put an end to that. I'm going to say we're going to give drug development and infectious disease a little break for 8 years. And we're going to find out why our kids are the sickest kids in the world. Find out why they have diabetes, why they have asthma, why these exponentially here better, larger than any other country in the world.
How do you do that? Everybody wants to hold on. They don't want to get smaller. They want to get bigger. And it's government's going to fix everything. Let's get more government. Let's get bigger government. Let's fix everything.
You have powerful industries like high fructose corn syrup that has millions of farmers and who've been sucked into that industry. Those companies have on their payrolls the chair of all the agricultural committees in both houses, and they own the USDA. So the question is, even if you found out that high fructose corn syrup was the cause of, a large cause of the obesity epidemic and diabetes epidemic, could you do anything about it? That's the question. Can you use power? And I know I can do it, and I'll tell you how. And all the things that I promise when I'm running are things that I can do without the help of Congress, because I know how things work, and I know you can't count on Congress anymore. I'm going to go down to NIH, and I'm going to say to them, we're going to find out what's causing these, and we're going to do a lot of science on them. Once you have that science that makes that causal connection between an exposure and an injury, you pass a threshold in the federal court called the Daubert threshold, which allows attorneys to bring lawsuits. When we brought the Monsanto lawsuit, everybody said you can never get Roundup. They're too powerful. The first case we won $289 million on. The second case we won $89 million. The third case, we asked the jury for $1 billion, and they gave us $2.2 billion. And then Monsanto came to the negotiating table, and they agreed to remove glyphosate from home gardening products. You can't do it through Congress. You can do it by generating enough really high quality, good quality science so that the attorneys can come in and do it. And it's the market fixing the problem rather than government.
Yeah. The thing that I'm concerned about is if we're trying to get government to fix all of this, then government's just going to get bigger and bigger and have a bigger role in people's lives. and more control in people's lives. And it seems to me that's the last thing we want. If you want something fixed, it seems to me if we let enterprising people work on it, enterprising people try to figure things out, they'll do it faster and cheaper than the government.
So, yeah, and you're right. The service on our debt now, that $34 trillion of debt, incidentally, President Biden is adding another $1 trillion every 90 days. That's the burn rate we have. It's insane. Right now, we're paying more to serve that debt, the interest on that debt, than our military budget. Within 5 years, President Trump and President Biden contributed that debt by thinking it was okay to shut down an economy for 500 days and then just print money.
Well, what do you think about this printing money business? I'm looking at this from the standpoint that I've been contributing to my retirement fund since the 80s on. It just keeps getting smaller and smaller. Isn't that just a tax on people?
Yeah, inflation is a tax, and it's a regressive tax. It taxes people on fixed incomes. It taxes working people. It's theft. It is stealing our money. The politicians don't come to us anymore and say, I'm going to spend $200 billion on Ukraine war, and, will you pay for it in advance by diminishing your expectations in life? They just go to the war. They spend $60 or $100 billion, and then they just print it at the other end. And that is a hidden tax on all of us, and it's a theft of the American people. And, that's another reason we got to unwind the war machine, which is what I'm going to do as president.
Well, you said you would end the war and stop Ukraine suffering.
Yeah.
How?
I negotiate an agreement, a deal with Vladimir Putin, which he's tried repeatedly to do. He gave us 2 deals already and signed one in April of 2022. It was a beautiful deal for our country, a beautiful deal for Ukraine. It would have left Donbass and Lugansk as part of Ukraine. It would have ended the war. The only thing he wanted, and this is what he said from the beginning, is an agreement with all of us to keep NATO out of Ukraine. And Zelensky signed it, and then Joe Biden sent Boris Johnson over to Kiev and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And 600,000 Ukrainian kids have died since then, all of them unnecessarily. My son fought over in Ukraine. My son was in a Foreign Legion squadron, and he fought in the Kharkiv offensive. But all these kids are dead. None of them needed to die. We had an agreement that would have been good for everybody.
You say you're going to cut military spending. Do you think Americans will sit still for that?
I think they're going to welcome it. I'm going to bring the military spending home to our country and start rebuilding our industrial base. We've destroyed the middle class in order to pay for the military spending. That does not make us a more powerful nation. I'm going to make our nation return our moral authority, return our influence to the world, and make us a stronger nation. I'm going to do that by cutting the military. We now have 800 bases abroad. The Russians have 1. The Chinese have 2, one which we built for them in Bagram in Afghanistan. But we have 800. We don't need that. We need to protect our borders. We need to protect the sea lanes and the neutral areas, and we can do that. I'm cutting the budget back to what the Eisenhower minimum, in other words, the height of the budget in real 2024 dollars during the Cold War. So if that budget was enough to protect our interests during the height of the Cold War, it's enough now. We've destroyed the middle class in this country, Phil. There's 61% of the people in this country, including a lot of people who watch your show, cannot put their hands on $500 if they have an emergency in their family. There's 60% are living hand to mouth, and they're desperate. They're facing eviction. They're facing starvation, and it's getting worse.
The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred on JFK's watch, and we had a genuine threat in Cuba at the time. And recently, Russia has reportedly moved warships, nuclear submarines, into Havana Harbor. This could potentially be on your plate in November. I mean, this could be history repeating itself.
I do the same thing my uncle did. My father went over to had Ambassador Dobrynin come over to the Justice Department, and they negotiated a deal. Khrushchev had moved those missiles into Cuba, was because we had just put Jupiter missiles in Turkey. right on his border. And he said, well, if you're going to put them over there, we're going to put them on your border. My father said, my uncle had already ordered them out, and the military had defied him. And my uncle and father made a secret deal with Brennan. If you move the missiles out of Cuba, we will move the missiles out of Turkey within 6 months, as long as nobody talks about the deal. And that's what they did. Well, Russia's doing the same thing now. We've just put missiles on their border in Poland, and they're nuclear ready. They're not, as far as we know, they're not armed, but they're armed with something else. Those are 12 minutes from Moscow. So we could decapitate the entire Soviet leadership in 12 minutes. If we get NATO, which is Biden's plan, into Ukraine, they'll be 4 minutes from Moscow. So of course the Russians aren't going to allow that any more than we would allow them to put nukes in Cuba. We're closer today to a nuclear war than we were at any time in history since 1962. And it's all just like it was during World War I. It's people in office who are sleepwalking into a conflict that we should have nothing to do with. Nothing.
I've been studying some things that are going on about China. We talked about health. We're getting 97% of our antibiotics from China. If they decide to turn that spigot off, we could be in a heck of a lot of trouble. We've got Chinese illegal immigrants coming across the border in record numbers, close to 30,000 in 2023. We've got them buying up farmland, coincidentally, around strategic military installations in the United States. I've got a map that is chilling. That's troublesome, is it not?
Very troublesome. And I've been fighting.
Why is this going on? Why is it being allowed?
The easiest explanation is always incompetence. And I think everything that we do on the China side, it's deliberative, it's smart, it's rational, and everything that we do is just, it seems to me to be inept. I was down on the border, and I know you've been there. In Yuma, I watched between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., 300 immigrants come across the border, carried there on big white buses by the Sinaloa drug cartels. It just seems insane to have drug cartels running U.S. immigration policy. Is there some nefarious treachery to our country? You could certainly look at what's happening and say it has to be, or you could say it's just utter incompetence. But with China, we need to take the steps to diminish our vulnerability to China. Do I think that we should be looking for a war with China? No. I think that we need to de-escalate tensions with China and understand that China wants to compete with us. They want to dominate the world, but they don't want a hot war. We spend 3 to 4 times what China does on our military budget. And China relies on, Walmart. They rely on Mideastern oil, which we could cut off. They don't want a war with us, but they do want to compete with us, and I'm not scared of competing with them economically. We need to start projecting economic power abroad rather than military power. It will.
Well, but it's hard for a corporation in America to compete with a government in China because they have forced labor. They don't worry about human rights. They have people working for 47 cents an hour in factories making gloves that we're buying for PPE. How do you compete when you have a free market corporation with minimum wage, human rights considerations, which all should be true, with a government that doesn't have those concerns?
Yeah, I think we need to have fair trade policies rather than free trade policies. Free trade is just a race to the bottom, and that's what, our government officials and trade negotiators have been doing for the past 30 years, is signing agreements that put American labor and American environment at risk and allow those governments to cheat. I don't think that we should do that anymore. When I'm president, we're going to stop doing that.
What are you going to do domestically with these people that are pushing DEI policies and this concept of equal outcome in place of a meritocracy that has made America what it is today?
I believe in equal opportunity, not equal outcome. I'm, against those to the extent that that's what those policies are advocating. I'm dead set against them.
And how do you get that into the mindsets of our university that's preparing the next generation to take over this country. We have universities, particularly our elite universities, that are failing to teach critical thinking and have students that are celebrating Hamas. I've seen and heard things on college campuses I never thought I'd see and hear in my lifetime. The anti-Semitic rhetoric. I've been to Israel. I've seen what took place there, and I see American students celebrating. At first, it was Palestinians, Gazans. That was a thin veil. Then it's just straight up Hamas. And I'm thinking, I can't believe my eyes. I can't believe my ears. And I've said so quite loudly. I'm wondering what they're teaching these kids if they don't have the ability to actually evaluate what's taking place. This was a murderous invasion. What do you do to change the university environment? And what do you do to try and get these universities to have some balance in what they're doing? There's a difference between free speech and actually intimidating Jewish students to the point of fearing for their lives and their safety.
There are so many things that I hear about, Israel being an apartheid state. There's ethnic cleansing taking place all over the Mideast, but people only complain about Israel. Palestinians have all the rights that Jews have. Palestinians can vote. They can serve they can serve in the Knesset. There's a dozen Palestinians in the Knesset. There's nothing like that in any of the other surrounding countries.
That's not apartheid.
This is the only democracy in the Mideast. It's the only place where there's freedom for gays. They hang gays in Gaza. They hang them in Tehran from cherry pickers. It's the only place where women have any rights in the Mideast. And it has freedom of expression, it has freedom of worship, it has freedom of the press.
Would you continue to support Israel?
Yeah, I think America needs to wind down military commitments abroad in terms of regime change wars, et cetera. Israel today is facing an existential crisis. Its actual existence is in doubt. And Israel is in a 5-front war. People say you should have a ceasefire with Hamas, and I would love to see that. Every death I see over there is heartbreaking. But how do you have a ceasefire? How do you have a negotiation with somebody who, in their charter, it says any negotiation with Israel is against Islamic law? I don't see how you do that. What we saw on October 7th came from a place of pure hatred and evil from kids who are raised from when they're in kindergarten to utterly dehumanize Jews and to be sworn to believe that it's glorious to kill them. I understand that Israel doesn't feel that it can, that there's any ending here if Hamas is left in charge of Gaza. I don't see how you do it.
I sat with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I came away from that with a clear understanding. He does not intend to stop until he has eliminated Hamas. He'll do it alone with the support of the world or not.
I'm not a huge fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Likud, but that policy is widely supported.
How would you resolve the division in this country? What's the ticket?
Well, I said it a little over a year ago, 13 months ago, when I announced that I was not going to feed into the vitriol and the anger and the hatred and the division. I was not going to focus on the cultural war issues that are used to keep us all apart and at each other's throats. I was going to focus on the values that keep us all together, that we all share in common. And what I found is that those values occupy much greater landscape than the little cultural war issues, abortion, guns, trans rights, the ones that we're all fighting about all the time. Everybody wants to fix our schools. Everybody wants teachers to be properly paid. Everybody wants to take care of our vets who are suffering from PTSD. And everybody wants to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power. Nobody wants the border being run by the Sinaloan drug cartels. Everybody wants to figure out a way that we can bring blockchain and AI into our country and make ourselves the hub where we can grow the economy out of this deficit. Nobody wants AI being used as a mechanism for the government to control us and to surveil us. Everybody wants to protect the environment. If you talk about clean air, clean water, wildlife conservation, our Purple Mountains majesty, everybody is going to be behind you. Republicans and Democrats, everybody wants clean food for our children, to get rid of all these chemicals. If you want to start a fist fight, just talk about climate and nothing else. And then you're going to have a war and you're not going to get anything done. But if you talk about, how do we reduce our dependence on foreign oil? How do we take care and mountaintop removal mining in the Appalachians? How do we stop the mercury contamination from coal burning power plants of our fish? Everybody wants that to happen, and they're willing, to fight for it. These issues are framed today in a way that is calculated to keep us at each other's throats. And it's like the jangling keys. It's BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They're now trying to buy housing, the residential housing, the agricultural lands. They're jangling the keys over here and say, look at the abortion issue, look at the guns, and look at trans rights. And over here, they're strip mining the wealth from the American middle class. Are making it so our kids can't afford houses. We have the first generation of kids that's not going to own their own house. I'm going to change that. I have a whole retinue of policies to make sure every one of these kids who works hard, who plays by the rules, is going to get into a home. And we need to do that. We owe that to our children.
Is government going to do that?
Government can't do it.
You talk about millions of jobs for the blacks. Is that government that's going to do that? Is government getting bigger and bigger and creating all these jobs?
My job is to shrink government and make it less expensive and more efficient. And we have opportunities to do that today. One, the biggest expense is chronic disease in our military-industrial complex. We also can cut waste in government like never before. The Pentagon audit that came out last month showed that they lost $4 trillion. They haven't passed an audit in 20 years. They lost this inventory. They don't know where it is.
What do you mean they lost $4 trillion? They don't know where it is?
They don't know where it is. And most of it is inventory, things they bought that they lost track of. A lot of times they'll buy 2 or 3 or 4 times the same item because they can't find it. But you can use AI walkers to go through all the stockpiles and identify every single thing that's in there so you don't lose anything ever. And you can use blockchain to make sure that every American can see every expenditure from the Pentagon, make sure we're not buying, $16,000 toilet seats. And we have an opportunity now to eliminate waste like nothing before in history. And I have a strategy for doing that and how to get it through Congress. Because that one, we do need to get through Congress.
And when you talk about climate change, how do you keep out of a fist fight about that and just start doing things that make a difference?
I believe climate change is existential. I believe that it's related to human emissions, various kind of emissions, carbon and methane, but I don't insist anybody else does. And I know there's a lot of people who just don't believe that, but I believe it. I also have been working on those issues for many, many years, and I don't believe in top-down solutions. I always talk about market-based solutions, that we need free markets, that if we actually had true free markets in this country, we wouldn't have any pollution. A true free market promotes efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. A true free market would require us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that cause us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. So they raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. It's always a subsidy involved. And I'm going to eliminate the subsidies.
Do you agree that you don't subsidize things you don't want more of?
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty obvious. I say it because it sounds so obvious. If somebody's going to be president of the United States, we subsidize things we don't want more of, but yet we subsidize them. We paid people more to stay home during COVID than they could make if they went to work, right? And so they did. And then it opens back up and people say, I can't figure out what happened to the supply chain. Well, hell, you paid everybody to stay home. They stayed home instead of working. You say the explanation is incompetence. Can they be that incompetent? Can they be so incompetent that we're going to pay people to sit home in a beanbag and eat Cheetos, and then we're scratching our head why we can't get anybody to work in the hotels, the hospitality industry, unload the ships in the harbor, put the containers up? How do we keep that from happening again when the next pandemic comes down the road?
Well, I mean, if I get to office, we're not going to lock people down during a pandemic.
Okay, I'm underlining that.
It's not the first time I've said
I'm
people
throwing
down.
you a softball here because I want you to have a chance to say it again.
Because I was actually reading the protocols, that were written by WHO and CDC and
So was I.
FDA, and they were all saying you never lock a society down. You take care of the vulnerable, but you let everybody else go to work because you're going to kill more people with the lockdown than not, and particularly with a respiratory virus, because it's going to spread at home. Everything they did was exactly the opposite of what you do. I mean, they were giving tickets to surfers in Malibu, right? They were getting surfers out on the ocean, getting plenty of vitamin D sunlight out there, and they were calling them in. The police were coming to the beach, calling them in and giving them $1,000 tickets and sending them home when this was a virus that only spread in the house. They went to Compton and Harlem, and they put padlocks on the basketball courts, and they locked those kids in with the Cheetos. I got called a conspiracy theorist because back in May of 2020, I said, these vaccines are not going to prevent transmission. There's a tape of me saying exactly what they were going to do back then, that they're going to tell us is 100% effective, and then they're 80%, 70%, et cetera. So the regulators knew that, and yet they were saying something the opposite of that.
If you were going to say what the Biden administration is doing to keep you from running for president, to keep you as out of this race as possible, what are they doing? You're not in the debate.
They're blocking me from participating in the debate. They told CNN they would not show up at the debate if I was on the stage. They're suing me to try to keep me off the ballot. They won't provide me Secret Service protection. I have to spend $1 million a month on my security.
The fifth person in your family to run, 2 have been assassinated.
Yeah.
And you don't get Secret Service.
No, well, my Uncle Teddy ran for president too, but they gave him Secret Service 550 days out, even before he was running, and it was a president who hated him.
Yeah, so that's 3.
Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter had class enough to give it to somebody because he knew for the American public and American people, it's important to show that these federal institutions are not being weaponized for political purposes, and they've weaponized the Secret Service. I meet all the metrics for protection. There have been 33 candidates who got it prior to the 120-day. You're entitled to it 120 days from November. There have been 33 candidates who've gotten it before that, most of whom had a fraction of the support that I have. It's a distressing time for American democracy.
If you don't get to a point where you have a clear path to 270 electoral votes, if you don't get into the debates, if it's not clear that you can win the election, what do you do with your substantial and passionate following? Clearly, you have a significant following. You can impact this race significantly if you don't win. What do you do with that? You could be the decider in this race.
Yeah, I've offered President Biden because so many people have said, oh, you're going to be a spoiler and you're going to get Donald Trump elected, and that's going to be the end of the Republic. And of course, people who support President Trump say the same thing about President Biden. But what the poll that Zogby did, which is the biggest poll taken, and that poll showed that President Biden cannot win the election. If I'm in, he loses. President Trump wins. If I'm out, he loses 2 more states. He loses Maine and Virginia. And so I said, but I can win. If he withdrew, then I could beat President Trump. And if Trump withdrew, which of course he's not going to, I could beat I will, landslide against President Biden. So I said to President Biden, I sent him a proposal. I said, let's do a spoiler agreement where we will co-fund a poll together, the two of us, and whoever in October and whoever is least likely to vote to beat Donald Trump will withdraw. So do I expect that he will take that deal? No. But, I'm not a spoiler. A spoiler is somebody who cannot win
and stays in.
and they stay in and disrupt the expectations of somebody who can.
So you've made him that offer.
I've made him that offer, yeah.
Has he responded at all?
No.
Will he?
No. But I don't know where he's going to be at that point. I don't know. He seems, when you, every time I watch him, it's kind of heartbreaking. It's like watching your 5-year-old the first time they play on a jungle gym. You're like, is he going to be okay? And I don't know what the people around him are thinking of.
Is there any theory where you would run with him?
With President Biden?
Right.
No.
No way.
No.
And so if the polls are clear, does the Democratic Party make a deal with you? If he steps aside, if he comes up with some theory in the fall, made up or otherwise, and says, I'm going to have to step aside for health reasons or whatever, do they come to you? Do they look at the poll and come to you?
If they did, I would listen to that proposal. But I doubt if they would, because the people who will then make the decision are the superdelegates, and the superdelegates are people who work for or are the possessions of the big corporate lobbyists that fund the Democratic Party. So the lobbyists that fund the party, the big corporations like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, all the military contractors, the pharmaceutical companies, they control the superdelegates. And I think those people, they would rather see President Trump in office than see me in office.
Well, if Trump's side's not going to come to you, then have you built yourself in a box you can't get out of?
Well, I get a lot of Trump voters. So, I get 57% of the people who support me say that they would vote that if I leave the race, they'll vote for President Trump. And then I get a lot of people who were not going to vote at all, no matter what, except if you run. We're not going to choose between the lesser of two evils. But, right now, I'm beating President Trump and President Biden in these key demographics. The one group that I don't do well with, which is my Achilles heel, my key group, is baby boomers. If you think about it, the baby boomers should like me because, they were here during the Kennedy era. They remember Camelot with nostalgia. And they loved me when I was only the environmental champion and before I, started working on public health. But what we found is that, I think the reason they don't like me is because they hear all of the sort of the defamations that you outlined at the beginning of this interview. He's anti-vax. He thinks chemicals cause you to be gay. All the ways that those things are treated, the way that they're repeated and they're mischaracterized in the press. So they think I'm genuinely a lunatic, right?
Are you?
Am I a lunatic? Now, I feel like, of course, if you ask a lunatic whether they're a lunatic, they're never going to know. So
are you a lunatic?
No, of course not. Listen, I've had a long career with so many milestones that would be pretty unattainable by somebody who is a lunatic. I've won hundreds of cases. I've written dozens of best-selling books on different issues, and I have good relationships. All these, so I feel like I'm defending myself and proving that I'm not a lunatic, which of course is never a good sign.
And I am baby boomers, and that's why I wanted people to hear you talk about the things that you've talked about, because you make a compelling argument for the things that we've talked about, and I've endeavored to give you every opportunity to clear up any misperceptions. And I think you've done an amazing job of doing just that. I don't tell people get out and vote. I'm not the guy that does that. I say, do not get out and vote. Get out and make an informed vote. Don't just get out and vote a ticket. know who you're voting for. Find out what they stand for, what they really think, feel, believe, and are committed to, and then make your vote. And that's why I love this long-form thing, so people can find out. I didn't just read a headline about Robert Kennedy Jr. I listened to, and they will listen to this top, side, and bottom, and usually more than once. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we should?
Well, I have the highest favorability rating of any of the people that they've polled. So given a choice, people would rather vote for me, and they would rather vote for a candidate that inspires them and that gives them hope for our country and for their future, for rebuilding the middle class, for ending this debt crisis, et cetera, and winding down the wars. But many of them say that they're going to vote for President Biden because otherwise Trump will get elected. So it's out of fear. And the same is true to some extent of President Trump. People say, we got to keep Biden from getting reelected. So they're relying on fear to get the other one elected and the division. And that amplifies that division because they can't solve that division that is really critical that we need to solve right now because they feed on it and they profit from it and they rely on it. They rely on you hating the other guy. I just say, let's talk about the issues that we all agree on because that's how to make America better. And if I can get people to vote out of hope, then I'll win the election. If they continue to vote out of fear between now and November, then I'm going to lose. One of the big, I think, defamations about me is that I'm anti-vaccine, which is what people have said about me for 20 years. And I've always said, I'm not anti-vaccine. I'm fully vaccinated myself, not with COVID. All my childhood vaccines, my kids were all fully vaccinated. And my issue is, like every medicine, vaccines cause injuries. And we know this because the vaccine courts have paid out billions of dollars. The other thing they say is that we shouldn't talk about them because, it will harm public faith in the program. And that is where I differ. I think no matter how rare they are, that we need to take care of people who are injured. And that's the group I, am concerned about. And there are a lot of people who say, when I try to talk about this, I get gaslit, I get marginalized, I get vilified, I get my job taken away. And I think that's wrong. This is a product. It's the only product that you can't sue. So, vaccines, as you know, the Vaccine Act passed in 1986. You can't sue them if you're injured. So there's silence about injuries. What I say is, if they know they can be sued, they behave better. The four companies that make all 72 of the vaccines that are now mandated for our children, those four companies have paid something like $79 billion in criminal penalties over the past 20 years for other products they make for which they can be sued. We should be particularly careful about protecting people who are injured. And that's all I'm saying. I'm never going to take anybody's vaccine. If vaccines are working for you, and God bless you, I believe in choice, in liberty. The government shouldn't be ordering people to take a product, particularly one that is protected from liability.
And they're getting paid for.
Right. But ultimately, my default position is always going to be freedom. And, freedom of choice. And we ought to be able to have the right to make informed choices. The government has shown that it's too corrupt, and its relationship with the pharmaceutical industry is too corrupt to trust them on these issues. We need oversight, and we need, safeguards. And that's my position on vaccines. Not that we should get rid of them, and it's not that they're bad. It's just that let's take care of the people who get injured.
So you want more transparency.
Yeah.
And if people want to take them, you recognize they do some good.
Yeah.
And people should have a choice.
Yeah.
But an informed choice. And I agree with you. There's not enough transparency about it. That's what you're after.
Exactly.
That's what I mean. There's a perception problem. I think a lot of my audience hasn't heard you talk about that before today. So I think that's been a very revealing interview. I hope you think so.
I really enjoyed it, and thank you for, giving me this platform.
Yeah, I think people are going to learn a lot, and I can tell you, I've been talking to my audience leading up to this, and I said, I want to know what really matters to you, what's important to you. And it comes down to the same two things. Safety. They want to be safe, and they don't feel safe right now. They don't feel mentally and emotionally safe. They don't feel physically safe. And when I drill down on that a little bit, that involves the border, and it involves criminality on the streets, and that involves border. And a lot of them have problems with the fact that we're no longer seem to be a nation of law. People get arrested and turn right back out. So they don't feel safe. And the other is financial security. And if you look at all the way back to the 1940s when Maslow talked about the hierarchy of needs, it goes back to that. First was physiology, people wanting to survive. They want to be safe where they're not threatened and know that they can provide for themselves and their family. And everything after that, watch that third step, it's a doozy. That's what they're telling me. It's security, safety, and they just tell me, these politicians, they just don't read the room. They're asking us to meet them where they are. They don't seem to want to meet us where we are.
Well, that's my focus. And how do we rebuild the American middle class? More than half the people in this country are making $5,000 less than the cost of basic human needs, and they're putting that money on their credit cards. A couple months ago, we hit a milestone at $1 trillion of credit card debt. A guy at the gym yesterday told me that he just got a credit card bill charging 34% interest. If the mafia did that, they would be in jail for loan sharking. All of those companies are owned by BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And, so it's just these mechanisms for shifting wealth upward, and they are strip mining, they are vacuum cleaning the wealth and the equity from the American middle class. They've declared war on the middle class in this country. We cannot support this country with an oligarchy of billionaires. President Trump and President Biden, during 500-day lockdown, created 500 new billionaires, and they shifted $4.3 trillion north from the American middle class to this new oligarchy. You can't sustain democracy if you've just got a very, very wealthy above and widespread poverty below, and that's where we are in this country today.
They need to hear you talk about that, because I'm telling you, they think he's a Kennedy. Kennedy's a wealthy family. It's American royalty. He doesn't connect with us, doesn't know where we are. I mean,
I've been sitting, at kitchen tables like that for my whole career, because the career that I chose is representing people, mainly fishermen. My father, many years ago, he would bring us to Southeast Washington, to Appalachia, and he would bring us to the Indian reservations and to the Rust Belt. And he would say to us, and, we would go into people's houses and talk about how they lived. And he would say, these are our people. These are Kennedy people, because, the big shots, they don't need the Kennedys. It's the people who, are struggling to make this country a great nation and are struggling with their day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And they don't have a voice in Washington. And that's, what you're supposed to do with your life.
Robert, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Phil.
I'm really glad we did this.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
I want to thank Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for sitting down with me tonight. Never in American history have we faced such a critical moment. I'm not being dramatic here. The upcoming presidential election could quite literally change the direction of this entire country. The mainstream media and the polls wrote off Donald Trump, and now they're doing the same to RFK Jr. But I'd be careful believing every poll you read. As we all saw in 2016 when Hillary Clinton had her fireworks ready to go, you never know what can happen on election night. Regardless of whether RFK Jr. takes the White House, there is no doubt his campaign will be one of tremendous impact, president or not. We have an app, Merit Plus. It's free. Download it, and you can watch us on your phone or your iPad. Take us wherever you go. Doesn't matter.